There are moments in life when the train you step off doesn't just bring you to a new place, it drops you straight into someone else's ending. That's what happened to Margaret Hale, 50 years old, her hands calloused from years of work, her heart still stubborn enough to believe she might have one last chance at companionship. She had answered an ad for a mail-order bride, not for romance, not for wealth, but for the quiet dignity of belonging somewhere again. She imagined a man waiting at the station, maybe nervous, maybe hopeful. But when she arrived in that wind-bitten frontier town, there was no warm handshake, no smile, only the sound of coughing and the sight that stopped her mid-step. A man, pale, gaunt, fighting for breath, sitting in a chair beside the station wall. And at his boots, a little boy wrapped in a fraying shawl, eyes wide and watchful, as if he'd been guarding his father for years. The townsfolk passed them without pause. Some glanced their way, most didn't. Margaret's first thought was to turn back. This wasn't what she'd agreed to. But then the boy stood, walked up to her, and spoke 7 words that made the air feel heavier. "Ma'am, are you the one who came?" She didn't know yet that the man before her, Samuel Hart, had only weeks to live. She didn't know that the boy, Eli, would need her more than she'd ever been needed before. She also didn't know that by saying yes to the wrong beginning, she might stumble into the only life that had ever truly fit her. But the days ahead would demand more than kindness. They would test her strength, tear open old wounds, and force her to choose between walking away or planting her feet in a home built on lost hope and a love that would not come in the way she expected. What she did next would bind her name to theirs, not just in the town's memory, but in the heart of a boy who had already lost too much. And somewhere in that small, wind-worn house, under the weight of grief and the whisper of spring, Margaret would discover that some arrivals are not about being welcomed, but about becoming the welcome someone else has been waiting for. So what happened when the mail-order bride found no groom, only a dying man and a child who refused to let her leave? And what would she choose when the promise she made became the anchor holding 2 lives together? Stay with me, because sometimes the love that changes everything doesn't come in a wedding dress. It comes wrapped in a borrowed shawl and calls you mama before you've even unpacked your bag. The train pulled into Dry Creek Station with a hiss that sounded like it had been holding its breath all winter. Margaret Hale, 52, stepped down from the carriage with the careful grace of a woman who had learned not to take her balance for granted. Her traveling coat was plain, but pressed the hem, brushing her sturdy boots. In her gloved hand she carried a small leather case, and inside it, folded so many times the paper had grown soft, was the letter that had sent her here. It had been short, and all the better for it. "Dear Miss Hale, I am a widower in need of companionship and steady hands. I have a small farm, a good heart, and a boy who needs a mother's touch. If you are willing, I will meet you at the station come spring. Samuel Hart." Margaret had read those words each night since it arrived. After years of polite rejections and colder silences, here was a man who saw worth in her steadiness, not in the bloom of youth she no longer carried. But as the platform emptied, no one stepped forward. The few townsfolk who lingered kept to themselves, watching her the way people watch a stranger, curious but not welcoming. When she finally asked the station master, he shifted awkwardly. "If you're Miss Hale," he said, "Mr. Hart took poorly a week ago. You'll find him at the parsonage," but he hesitated. "Best prepare yourself, ma'am. He's not got long." The walk to the parsonage felt longer than it was. Dust swirled at her ankles. The spring sun carried no warmth. And there on the porch, she saw him propped in a chair, skin pale and drawn tight over his bones. At his feet, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, far too big for him, was a boy no more than 7 eyes, watchful and wary. Margaret stopped at the steps. She had come expecting a beginning. Instead, she felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She took a slow breath and said softly, "Mr. Hart." His eyes found hers, and a ghost of a smile tugged at his mouth. "You came," he whispered. And that was the moment Margaret knew this journey would not be what she had planned. But it might be something she was meant for. The parsonage smelled faintly of boiled potatoes and lamp oil. The Reverend's wife led Margaret inside with the kind of quiet sympathy reserved for funerals. Samuel Hart's bed was set up in the small front room so he could see the window. His breathing was shallow but steady, each inhale a labor. The boy Eli kept near the wall, clutching the oversized shawl like it was a shield. His eyes never left Margaret, measuring her with the caution of someone who had seen strangers come and go, leaving only emptiness behind. Margaret took a seat beside Samuel's bed, setting her gloves in her lap. "You wrote to me," she said softly. Samuel's lips curved faintly. "Didn't think you'd really come." "I did," she replied, and though she meant to sound calm, there was a crack in her voice. Outside, wind rattled the thin window pane. Inside, the Reverend's wife brought tea that Margaret barely touched. She sat hour after hour speaking in low tones, when Samuel stirred, simply being there when he slept. That night when she rose to leave, Eli stepped into her path at the door. His small voice barely carried. "Are you gonna go away too?" Margaret knelt until they were eye to eye. "Not tonight," she said. "Not until I know you're both looked after." Eli studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, as if granting her a chance she hadn't asked for. And in that moment, she felt something shift, not in the house, but in her. She had come as a bride. She might need to stay as something else entirely. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of care. At dawn, Margaret would light the stove, stir porridge for Eli, and bring warm broth to Samuel. She washed linens in the yard, her hands chapped from the cold pump water, and hung them to dry in the weak sun. Samuel spoke little, saving his strength for moments when Eli was near. But each time Margaret brought him water, his eyes followed her as if he was trying to memorize her shape, her presence. One evening when she was tucking the shawl more tightly around Eli's shoulders, he asked, "Why are you doing all this?" Margaret paused. "Because people should be cared for when they can't care for themselves." He frowned, small and serious. "Mama used to say that before." His voice faltered and he buried his face in the shawl. Margaret didn't press. She simply smoothed his hair and stayed until his breathing slowed into sleep. Yet under her calm hands, a storm brewed in her heart. She had come for a life with a husband, maybe a place to belong. But here she was caught between a dying man, a grieving boy, and the whisper in her own chest that she might lose them both before the season turned. The Reverend's wife warned her gently, "You're getting attached, Miss Hale. Be careful with your heart." But Margaret had lived too long with a heart kept behind walls, and some walls she thought were meant to fall. It was near midnight when Margaret awoke to the sound of coughing, ragged, wet, and desperate. She lit the lamp and hurried to Samuel's side. He was half sitting, one hand clutching his chest, the other gripping the blanket. She held a cup of water to his lips, steadying it when his hands shook. When the fit passed, he lay back, eyes closed, chest rising unevenly. "I wanted to see you in the spring sunshine," he murmured. "Not like this." "You will," she said, though she knew the words were a gift more than a promise. He opened his eyes and looked at her in a way that made time slow. "When I wrote to you, I didn't think I'd be giving you a boy instead of a life. But Eli, he needs someone steady. If I don't last," he swallowed hard, "don't let him be alone." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I won't," she whispered. From the small cot in the corner, Eli's voice drifted in the dim light. "I'm not asleep," he said softly. Margaret glanced at him. He was sitting up, clutching the shawl, eyes shining with the kind of fear that only children know, that the world might take everything in one breath. She crossed the room and sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "We're both here," she said, "and I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't just comfort she was giving, it was a vow. The morning came pale and quiet, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Margaret rose early, stirring the fire before the cold could creep in. She brewed tea, though her hands trembled more than the cup. Samuel was awake, his gaze fixed on the window. "Sun's up," he said, his voice thin but warm. "I can feel it." Margaret moved his chair so he could see better. The light caught on his face, softening the lines, making him look for a moment like the man he must have been years ago. Eli climbed onto the arm of the chair, leaning into his father's side. Samuel's arm, weak but sure, wrapped around him. "I love you, boy," Samuel whispered. "Be good and listen to her." His eyes flicked toward Margaret. "She's stronger than she knows." Margaret swallowed, her voice steady, only because it had to be. "We'll take care of each other." By mid-morning, Samuel's breathing slowed. Margaret stayed beside him, holding his hand until it grew still in hers. The Reverend closed Samuel's eyes with a gentle touch. Eli didn't cry at first. He just pressed his face into Margaret's skirt and stayed there, shaking silently. Margaret smoothed his hair, her own tears falling into the crown of his head. "It's all right," she whispered, though they both knew it wasn't. Not yet. In that moment, she understood her reason for coming here had changed. She wasn't just a mail-order bride anymore. She was the boy's anchor in a world suddenly adrift. The weeks after the burial passed like slow-moving clouds, heavy, but with hints of light breaking through. Margaret stayed in the Hart house not because she had nowhere else to go, but because Eli never once asked her to leave. He followed her through the rooms like a shadow, his small footsteps always finding hers. At first they spoke little. Margaret let the quiet be, knowing words could bruise as much as they could heal. Instead, she cooked meals he would eat, mended his clothes, and read to him at night by lamplight. One afternoon, she found him in the yard trying to patch a loose fence board with nails far too big for his hands. She crouched beside him, guiding the hammer in his grip. "You don't have to fix everything today," she said gently. He looked up at her face, smudged with dust. "Pa used to say that. When I broke the cartwheel last winter." Margaret smiled faintly. "Sounds like he was right." The boy nodded, then, without warning, leaned into her, resting his head against her shoulder. She didn't move for a long time, afraid that if she did, the moment might vanish. That night, as she tucked the shawl around him, Eli whispered, "Don't go away, Margaret." She touched his hair. "Not while I'm needed. And maybe not after that either." It was the first time she believed she might belong here, not by arrangement, but by choice. Spring came slowly to the prairie, as if testing the ground, before taking root. The snow receded, the creek began to murmur again, and the apple tree by the porch showed the first blush of blossoms. Margaret found herself humming while sweeping the porch one morning. Inside, Eli was setting the table, arranging each plate with a precision that made her smile. It had been months since Samuel's passing, and though grief still lived quietly in the corners of the house, it no longer filled every room. Neighbors began stopping by more often. Mrs. Whitaker with seed packets, the miller's wife, with a loaf of bread. They didn't come out of pity anymore, but with the easy warmth of those who recognized a household standing on its own. One afternoon, the Reverend's wife pulled Margaret aside. "You could marry again, you know. You're still young enough to have companionship." Margaret glanced toward Eli, who was laughing at the creek's edge with a neighbor's dog. "I already have companionship," she said softly, "and more purpose than I ever expected." Later that evening, as the sun slid low and painted the horizon gold, Eli came running up the porch steps, breathless. Margaret looked the first wildflowers. He pressed a small, uneven bouquet into her hands. She knelt to meet his gaze. "They're beautiful," she said, though she was looking at him, not the flowers. For the first time in years, Margaret felt it, not borrowed, not bought, but truly hers. A home, a family, and a life chosen freely. In the end, Margaret didn't find the life she'd imagined. She found something better. There were no wedding bells, no fresh start in the way the world likes to picture it. Instead, there was a small house where grief slowly loosened its grip, where a little boy learned to laugh again, and where a woman who thought her best years were behind her discovered she was exactly where she was meant to be. Life has a way of surprising us like that. Sometimes the path we planned fades away, and another rises in its place, one that asks more of us, but also gives more in return. Margaret came to that town to be chosen, but in the end she chose them, and that choice made all the difference. If you've ever felt like life passed you by, remember, love doesn't always arrive on time, but it arrives right when it's ready. Here on Wild West Saga, we tell stories that remind us of that truth. If this one touched your heart, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe so you won't miss the next. And I'd love to hear from you. Would you want to see what happened to Margaret and Eli after the first spring came to their home? Or maybe you'd like more stories of second chances, found families, and love that comes when we least expect it. Share your thoughts below. Your words matter here.